Sometimes the purest forms of love come on four legs. They wait for us, protect us, walk miles just to see us again more. And sometimes they save our lives in the most unexpected ways. Tonight, you're invited on a journey through 10 extraordinary true stories, tales of loyalty, bravery, and unconditional love that will warm your heart and maybe even bring a tear to your eye. This is Pawprints of the Heart, 10 dog stories that will melt your soul. Story 1, Hachiko, the dog who waited forever. In the bustling streets of 1920s Tokyo, where trains clattered and crowds passed by without a glance, one dog waited, day after day, year after year. Hachiko, a golden-furred Akita, walked each morning with his beloved owner, Professor Hidesaburo Ueno, to Shibuya Station. The professor would ruffle the dog's fur and whisper, "Be good, I'll be back soon." And each afternoon at precisely 3 p.m., Hachiko would return to that same spot, waiting for the man whose scent lingered on the breeze. But one day, Professor Ueno never came back. He had died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage while at work. The family was devastated. Hachiko too waited. But he did not know death had taken his master. Every day, without fail, Hachiko returned to the station. Through summer heat, biting winter snow, pouring rain, he sat by the gate, eyes fixed on each passenger that stepped onto the platform. Passers-by began to notice. Some offered food, others tried to coax him home. But he stayed, always waiting. Soon Hachiko became a familiar presence. Students saluted him, workers greeted him. He was no longer just a dog, he was a story unfolding in real time, a quiet symbol of devotion. Journalists wrote about him, the nation watched, and Hachiko waited for 9 years. On March 8, 1935, Hachiko was found lifeless on the street near the station. Locals wept openly. He had become theirs. His story touched so many that a bronze statue was placed at Shibuya Station, where it still stands today. During rush hour, thousands pass by. Some stop, some whisper, some pet the statue's head, as if hoping to borrow a little of his devotion. Hachiko's story isn't just about loyalty, it's about enduring love, about the silent power of waiting, and about how one dog taught an entire nation that love, even when unreturned, is never wasted. Story 2, Capitan, the dog who slept by his owner's grave. In the quiet town of Villa Carlos Paz, Argentina, love outlived death and walked on 4 legs. When Miguel Guzman passed away suddenly in 2006, his family buried him in the local cemetery and returned home in sorrow. But just days later, they noticed someone was missing, Capitan, Miguel's loyal German shepherd. They searched the neighborhood, called his name through the streets, checked with neighbors, and even placed notices around town. But Capitan was gone, vanished. Weeks passed. Then, one Sunday, the Guzman family went to visit Miguel's grave, and there he was, curled up on the earth beside the headstone, thin and quiet, eyes heavy but alert. Somehow, Capitan had found his master's grave, even though he'd never been taken there. No one knew how he had done it. No scent trail, no guide, just love. The cemetery caretakers explained that Capitan had shown up weeks ago. He wandered the paths, sniffing the air, until he reached Miguel's grave. And from that moment on, he never left. He slept there every night, resting his head on the stone, as if to feel the presence of the man he had lost. The family tried to bring him home. They coaxed him into the car, fed him warm food, gave him his old bed by the fireplace. But every night, just before sunset, Capitan would slip away and walk back to the cemetery. It became a rhythm of mourning, devotion, and instinct. Year after year, Capitan continued this vigil. Rain or shine, winter frost or summer heat. He would greet visitors politely, never aggressive, just a silent, soulful sentinel of sorrow and love. Children would sit with him, Couples would pause to pet his fur. He became a fixture, almost holy in his loyalty. Caretakers fed him, bathed him, cared for his aging body. But Capitan belonged to the grave. He was not just grieving, he was keeping watch. For over 11 years, he stood guard. Until one morning in 2018, they found him lying peacefully beside Miguel's grave, eyes closed, breath still. He had stayed until the very end. Today, a statue stands not far from where Capitan lay, built by the community who had come to love the dog as their own. Tourists stop, locals bring flowers, children leave notes. Because Capitan reminds us all that the heart knows no boundaries, not death, not time, not distance. His loyalty didn't end when his master did. It endured, quietly and completely, until he could finally lie down beside him, forever. Story 3, Baby and the Muddy Shepherd. In a small farmhouse nestled on the edge of a Montana field, a storm rolled in with no warning. The sky turned charcoal, and wind howled like a chorus of ghosts. Rain pelted the windows in angry waves. 10-year-old Ellie pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. Beside her sat Baby, a black lab mix with warm eyes and ears tuned to something distant. Baby growled, a low, concerned sound that made Ellie look up. Then came a faint, barely audible whimper, carried on the wind. Without hesitation, Ellie pulled on her rain boots, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door. Baby dashed out ahead of her into the storm. They trudged across the muddy field, boots sinking with every step. The rain was so thick it blurred everything into shadows, but Baby kept going, nose to the wind, guided by something stronger than sight. Then Ellie saw it. A ditch had overflowed with water and sludge. Lying half-buried in the mud, barely visible, was a dog. Her body trembled. Her eyes fluttered open and closed. Ellie gasped. It was a German shepherd, and she was pregnant. "Hang on, girl," Ellie said, voice shaking. She knelt beside the dog, brushing away mud, and wrapped her raincoat around her. Baby circled them protectively as Ellie called for her mum. Minutes later, headlights cut through the storm. Her mother rushed down the field with a blanket, and together they lifted the weak dog into the truck. At the vet's office, the prognosis was dire. The shepherd was exhausted, malnourished, and moments from collapse. But she was alive. They named her Grace. For days, Grace lay quietly in a corner of the living room, curled in blankets, Baby always nearby. He watched her, slept beside her, nudged her gently when she whimpered in her sleep. Ellie never left her side. Then one morning, with spring light breaking through the storm clouds, Grace gave birth. 7 puppies, each tiny, blind, and crying for warmth. Ellie wept with joy. Baby licked each one gently like an honorary father. News spread quickly in their small town. Donations came in. Neighbors offered homes for the puppies. The storm had destroyed fences and flooded roads, but it had also brought something beautiful. Of the 7 pups, Ellie chose to keep one, the smallest, the one with a little white patch on his chest. She named him Lucky. Grace, once buried in mud and fear, now roamed the yard with her tail held high, and Baby, her silent rescuer, stayed beside her as if to say, "I found you once. I'll never let you go again." From the depths of the storm came a rescue, from the mud a rebirth, and in the hearts of a girl and her dogs, an unshakable bond forged in rain, courage, and love. Story 4, The Dog Who Walked 2,000 Miles Home. In the summer of 1923, the Brazier family of Silverton, Oregon, embarked on a road trip to visit relatives in Wolcott, Indiana. With them was their beloved dog, Bobby, a medium-sized Scotch collie and English shepherd mix with a white blaze on his nose and a gentle loyalty in his eyes. Bobby had always been more than a pet. He was a companion to the children, a shadow to the father, and a source of comfort to the mother. Calm, affectionate, and obedient, he belonged in the family like a heartbeat belongs in a chest. But during the trip, tragedy struck. In the unfamiliar town of Walcott, Bobby was frightened by a pack of stray dogs and bolted. The family searched for days, plastering posters, asking strangers, and walking the dusty roads until their feet bled. But there was no sign of Bobby. Heartbroken, they returned home without him. Weeks passed, then months. Winter arrived, life went on, but there was an emptiness in the home, a silence in the hallway where paws used to echo. Then 6 months later, something miraculous happened. A scraggly, limping dog stumbled into the center of Silverton. His coat was matted, his paws torn and bleeding, ribs sharp beneath his thinning fur. But in his eyes was a light dimmed by pain but unmistakable. It was Bobby. He had walked, yes, walked more than 2,000 miles to return home. Through mountains and deserts, over rivers and snow-covered fields, across 6 states, alone, with no map, no guide, just a memory of home and the will to get there. Veterinarians examined him and confirmed it was indeed Bobby. Scars, markings, and even a unique limp in his back leg, all matched. More astonishing were the reports that soon came pouring in from towns along the route. People remembered feeding him scraps. Children remembered playing with him. Bobby had left behind a quiet trail of wonder across America. News of his return made national headlines. He was dubbed Bobby the Wonder Dog, and for a while he was the most famous dog in the country. Parades were thrown in his honor. Letters arrived from admirers all over the world. But to the Brazier family, he wasn't a celebrity. He was simply their Bobby, tired, scarred, but home. Bobby lived several more years, spending his remaining time close to the fireplace he had once slept beside, and in the arms of the children who never stopped hoping. He is buried in Oregon with a headstone that reads, "Bobby the Wonder Dog, a true heart that found its way home." Because sometimes the longest journey is not measured in miles, but in the strength of love that refuses to forget the way. Story 5. Ruby the rescue pup turned hero. Ruby was trouble. That's what the shelter staff said anyway. A high-energy Australian Shepherd and Border Collie mix, she bounced off the walls of her kennel, barked constantly, and chewed through anything that stood between her and the outside world. 5 times she was adopted, 5 times she was returned. Too much energy, too wild, too stubborn. And now her time was running out. But at the 11th hour, her life changed. A Rhode Island state trooper named Dan O'Neill walked into the shelter looking for a dog to train for search and rescue. He had been warned not to adopt an untrained dog. But when he saw Ruby, something clicked. Her eyes were wild, yes, but they were also intelligent, curious, alive. He took a chance. The early days weren't easy. Ruby didn't follow orders. She bolted. She barked during drills. But Dan didn't give up. He trained her relentlessly, channeled her energy into learning, used patience instead of punishment, and slowly Ruby began to shine. She passed her K9 certification, and soon the dog that no one had wanted was riding in the front seat of a police cruiser, wearing a vest marked Search and Rescue. Over the years, Ruby worked dozens of cases tracking missing persons, searching dense woods, sniffing through debris. She saved lives, brought closure, brought hope. But the most astonishing moment came in 2017. A teenage boy had gone missing in a remote wooded area. Hours turned into a day. The sun began to set. The family feared the worst. Dan and Ruby were called in. After hours of searching, Ruby darted off into the trees, ears perked. Dan followed. There, beneath thick underbrush and near the edge of a ravine, lay the missing boy. Injured, unconscious, but alive. The miracle didn't end there. When the boy's identity was confirmed, Dan learned that the boy's mother was one of the original volunteers at the very shelter where Ruby had nearly been euthanized years before. She had fought to keep Ruby alive. She had begged people to give the dog a chance. And now Ruby had saved her son. It was a full-circle moment so powerful it brought even hardened officers to tears. Ruby was later named the 2018 American Humane Search and Rescue Hero Dog of the Year. Her story was shared on national television and even adapted into a movie. But to Dan, Ruby wasn't a celebrity. She was his partner, his best friend. The dog who taught him that second chances aren't just about saving lives, they're about believing in the ones the world gave up on. Ruby passed away peacefully in 2022. Her legacy lives on in every life she touched. She wasn't perfect. She was better. She was Ruby. Story 6, the puppy who stayed by a baby in the rubble. When the 7.2 magnitude earthquake struck Bohol, Philippines in 2013, it leveled homes, split roads, and turned entire villages into dust. Rescue teams flooded in, digging through rubble, calling out names and praying for signs of life. In one small village, nearly 2 days after the quake, rescuers were combing through the remains of a collapsed bamboo house. Most had given up hope of finding survivors, but then beneath the silence and shifting debris they heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, not quite a cry, not quite a bark. They dug faster. Under broken beams, dirt and shattered stone, they uncovered a miracle, a baby girl, barely 6 months old, wrapped in a torn blanket. She was bruised, pale, but breathing. Curled tightly around her was a small, scrappy puppy. The rescuers froze. The pup, dusty and thin, lifted his head and let out the softest whimper, as if asking for help, but not for himself. He had stayed with the baby through the quake, through the long hours of darkness, through hunger and fear. He had kept her warm, protected, alive. They were rushed to the hospital. The doctors confirmed it. Without the puppy's body heat, the baby likely wouldn't have survived the cold nights beneath the rubble. No one knew where the puppy had come from. Some said he was a village stray. Others believed he had been following the baby's mother in the days before the quake. But none could explain how or why he had stayed. The village named him Bante, which means guardian in Filipino. News of the puppy's heroism spread quickly. Journalists came. Aid workers brought food, toys, and medicine. But Bante stayed by the baby's side. Even in the hospital, he lay beside her crib, tail gently wagging, eyes always watchful. When the baby, who was named Amira, was released from the hospital weeks later, Bante followed her home. Her family, still shaken by the disaster, but overwhelmed with gratitude, adopted him without question. Years passed. Amira grew. She learned to walk, then run, and always Bante was at her side. He waited outside her preschool, slept at the foot of her bed, barked gently whenever a stranger came near. Their bond wasn't forged in a park or backyard, but in dust and disaster, and it was unbreakable. Bante lived a full life, never once straying far from Amira. When he passed away, the whole village mourned. They buried him beneath a mango tree near the rebuilt house and carved one word into the stone: hero. Because sometimes love arrives not with ceremony, but with fur, dirt, and a heart big enough to shield a child from the worst the world can bring. And sometimes a puppy in the rubble is the only guardian an angel needs. Story 7, Laika, the heroic military dog. In the harsh, dust-blown terrain of Afghanistan, where danger hid in every shadow and silence could signal ambush, soldiers relied not just on instincts, but on something even keener. Laika was a Belgian Malinois trained for war. Her ears caught what humans couldn't. Her nose detected threats before they struck, and her loyalty was unshakable. Assigned to a US Special Operations Unit, she was a frontline warrior. One afternoon, her team approached a suspected enemy compound. It looked quiet, but quiet was often a trap. Laika was sent in first. Seconds later, chaos erupted. Gunfire, shouts, explosions. Laika had located an enemy hiding inside, but she had taken the bullets before anyone else could. 4 gunshots tore into her body. Even then, wounded and bleeding, she continued to fight, saving her handler and his team. Because that's what soldiers do. They rushed her to a field hospital. Her heart was strong, but her leg was beyond saving. Surgery was long, uncertain. Her handler, Staff Sergeant Julian MacDonald, never left her side. When she woke, groggy and groaning in pain, he was there, hand on her head, whispering, You made it, girl. You made it. Many military dogs are retired after injuries. Some are quietly forgotten, but not Leica. Julian made a promise. If she saved my life, he said, I'll make sure hers is filled with love. He adopted her, fought through the military red tape, brought her home. At first, Leica struggled. Her missing front leg made it hard to balance. She slipped, she fell. But Julian cheered every small step. He taught her how to climb stairs again, to run on 3 legs, to live, not just survive. In the years that followed, Leica became more than a hero. She became a symbol. She visited schools and veterans' hospitals. Children reached out to pet her, awed by her strength. Wounded soldiers saw in her a mirror of their own fight. She reminded them, courage isn't about being whole, it's about showing up, even when broken. Leica's story went viral. She was featured in national magazines, honored by fellow servicemen, but at home she was just family. She played in the yard with Julian's kids, slept at the foot of the bed, wagged her tail when someone said her name. The battlefield felt like another lifetime, but the bond between her and Julian never faded. Every time he looked at her, he remembered the day she stepped between him and death. And every time she leaned into his side, he remembered that some debts of love are too big to repay, but worth trying every single day. Leica didn't just serve, she sacrificed. And in return she found not just a home, but a forever heart. Story 8. The Stray Who Saved a Family from a Fire. In a quiet suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, winter had settled in. Most homes were decorated for the holidays, their windows glowing warm yellow against the dark chill. In one such house on a quiet street, the Carter family was tucked into bed, mother, father, and their 3 children sleeping peacefully under thick quilts. Outside, the streets were silent, except for one shadow that moved alone. They called him Ghost. A stray dog with no collar and no home, he was known in the neighborhood for wandering near trash bins or watching from afar with wary eyes. No one knew where he came from. Most people ignored him. A few tried to feed him, but Ghost never stayed. Until that night. Around 2 a.m., Ghost began barking furiously outside the Carters' home. At first, it was just a few barks, then a frantic scratching at the front door. Inside, Mr. Carter stirred. His wife muttered sleepily, "It's that dog again." But the barking didn't stop. It grew louder, more urgent. Then came the smell. Smoke. Mr. Carter shot out of bed, heart pounding. He ran downstairs, flung open the door, and was nearly knocked back by a cloud of thick, grey smoke. Flames were licking the edges of the kitchen. The old wires in the walls had sparked. The fire alarms hadn't gone off yet. The family had minutes, maybe less. He screamed for his wife and children. Together, barefoot and choking on smoke, they scrambled out of the house. Outside, huddled in the cold, they stared at the fire consuming the place they called home. Firefighters arrived just in time to save the structure, but they all agreed if it hadn't been for the dog, the family might not have made it. When the smoke cleared, Ghost was gone. The Carters searched the neighborhood for days. They put out food, called his name, asked around. 3 nights later, they found him curled under their porch. He didn't run this time, just looked up with those same sad, soulful eyes. They opened the door. He walked in. They named him Ash in memory of what they had lost and who had saved them. He was no longer a stray. He had a bed, a bowl, a family. Ash spent his days watching over the children, resting in the sun, and barking every time someone approached the house. Not out of fear, but from duty. And on cold nights, when the fire crackled safely in the new fireplace, the Carters would sit beside him, rub his ears, and remember. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms, they don't speak, they don't ask for anything. They just show up. And they save us when we need them most. Story 9, Faith, the 2-legged dog who inspired millions. In a crowded litter born to a mother dog in Oklahoma City in 2002, one tiny puppy was different. She was born with only her 2 back legs. Her front legs were stunted and underdeveloped, useless for walking. Her mother, sensing the deformity, rejected her, pushed her away. refused to feed her. To most, the message was clear: she would not survive. But then came Jude Stringfellow, a single mother raising 3 kids. Jude saw the puppy's desperate wriggling and heard the faintest sounds of determination. She named the puppy Faith, not because of what she saw, but because of what she believed could be. At first, Faith scooted on her belly, dragging herself along the floor. The family made her a little skateboard. They tried slings and harnesses, helping her build strength in her hind legs. It wasn't easy. Faith fell, she cried, but she never stopped trying. Then one day she stood, unsteady, wobbling, but standing. The next day she took a step, then another. Then, with her head held high and tail wagging furiously, she began walking upright, like a little person. The world couldn't believe it. Videos of Faith walking on her 2 back legs spread like wildfire. People shared her story. Interviewers called. Children stared in awe. Veterans watched in silence, tears running down their faces. Jude took Faith on the road, not as a show, but as a message. They visited hospitals, wounded soldiers, burn units, children with disabilities. Faith would walk into the room, tail wagging, tongue lolling, and hearts would begin to open. People who hadn't smiled in weeks laughed. Kids in wheelchairs reached out to hug her. Adults who had given up began to believe again. Faith wasn't just a dog. She was a symbol. She proved that what seems broken can still be strong. That joy isn't tied to perfection. That walking doesn't always require 4 legs, just courage and love. She received awards, appeared on television, even joined the US Army as an honorary sergeant. But through it all, she remained sweet, playful, and endlessly loving. Faith lived a long, full life. When she passed in 2014, the tributes came from every corner of the world, from soldiers she'd comforted, children she'd inspired, and families she'd touched. They all said the same thing: she made me believe again. Because sometimes heroes aren't the ones who run the fastest or jump the highest. Sometimes they're the ones who fall 100 times, but stand again anyway, and walk forward, tail wagging, into a world that never expected them to rise. Story 10. The dog who wouldn't leave the hospital. In the heart of Istanbul, a bond between an elderly man and his dog turned into a quiet tale of devotion that would echo around the world. Cemal Şentürk had been feeling unwell for days. When the pain in his chest became too much to bear, neighbors called for an ambulance. As paramedics helped him into the vehicle, a small cream-colored dog with floppy ears and intelligent eyes followed closely behind. Her name was Boncuk, which means bead in Turkish, a name chosen for the sparkle in her gaze. The doors closed, the ambulance sped off, but Boncuk wasn't ready to say goodbye. She chased the ambulance down the street, her paws scrambling against pavement, until it disappeared into traffic. Most dogs would have wandered home. Boncuk didn't. Within an hour, she arrived at the hospital on her own. Security tried to shoo her away. She wouldn't budge. She sat at the front entrance, watching every pair of sliding doors, waiting for a face she knew. Nurses noticed. Doctors passed by. Someone brought her water. Someone else brought bread. Still, Boncuk waited. Day after day, she returned to the hospital. Each morning, she appeared just before sunrise. Each evening, she curled up in the corner of the hospital garden. For 6 days straight, she stood guard, not barking, not whining, just waiting. Cemal, recovering inside, didn't know. Then a nurse told him. "Your dog is here," she said, "every day." His eyes filled with tears. From his hospital bed, Cemal asked if they would take him to the window. When he saw her, sitting quietly by the gate, his voice broke. "That's my Boncuk," he whispered. "She always finds me." On the 7th day, Cemal was discharged. When he was wheeled out in a chair, Boncuk spotted him instantly. She jumped to her feet and whined softly, her tail thumping the ground. As he came closer, she nudged her nose into his hands, trembling with relief. There were no barks, no leaps, just a deep, steady silence, one only true love can bring. The reunion was filmed by a local news crew. The footage went viral. Around the world, people watched the moment Bonchuk was reunited with the man she refused to leave behind. Shamal took her leash, she walked beside him, and they went home together. Bonchuk never had formal training. She was not a service dog or rescue. She was just a companion, devoted and gentle, with no language except presence. But in that week outside the hospital, she reminded the world of something simple. You don't have to speak to show love. You just have to stay. Closing scene. Gentle piano music fades back in. Soft visuals of dogs playing, curled up with families, or sitting quietly at windows. In every paw print there's a story, a lesson, a reminder of loyalty that endures, of love that protects, and of courage that doesn't need words. These dogs, whether waiting at a train station, guarding a grave, chasing ambulances, or saving lives, show us the kind of devotion the world often forgets to notice. But you noticed, you listened, you felt it. And maybe tonight you're leaving this story with a little more belief in goodness, in quiet heroes, in love that simply stays. Visual fades to black. Logo of Pawprints Stories appears. Thank you for joining us. If these stories touched your heart, please consider sharing this video. Subscribe for more tales of love, loyalty, and the lives that change ours.